firstly, just to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this really, really special conversation between myself, Lisa Robin Wood, representing the Coaching Cast podcast, and Nathan, the neurodivergent coach. For those of you that do or don't know, myself and my podcast partner, Susie Hunt, who unfortunately is unwell today and isn't able to be here and is absolutely gutted, as am I, that she's not here. We have a podcast called The Coaching Cast. It is a podcast dedicated to support all of us in the working world who have been adjusting to the remoteness of the work environment. The podcast was very much about supporting individuals working remotely with their people management skills, as well as them managing themselves too, which I talk about a lot, because whether you manage people directly or not, you're still managing yourself. And all of that with an undertone of coaching, because Susie and I are both qualified professional coaches, and that is essentially what we do. So we work with managers and leaders around their management and leadership skills. So this special conversation today with Nathan is an extension of our podcast episode, because to be quite frank, we love talking to Nathan so much about the topic of neurodiversity that we couldn't really fit it all in one episode. And we thought, wouldn't it be brilliant to have more of a live conversation and invite people to join in for us to talk about this really key, important topic. So the format of the session today is going to be very much myself in conversation with Nathan, talking about the topic of neurodiversity, which we will do for the majority of the session. And then there will be time at the end for those of you who have questions for Nathan or myself to ask questions. And what I would ask you to do is, if you've got those questions in mind, hold them in mind. If you don't feel comfortable to ask them personally, please do feel free to place them into the chat box. I am acting as host, interviewer, and tech expert today because I don't have my partner in crime, Suze, with me. So please forgive me if I do miss your question, and just put your hand up, as we've all got a bit used to in the Zoom space. So yes, I hope that's okay for everybody. Anyone who's I've just let in who was just a little bit late, just to let you know, we are recording today. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, please just keep yourself on mute and mute your video as well. But yeah, so I think if everyone's happy, we'll get cracking. As I said, we may have a few more people joining us, but we'll get going to keep us on time. So I've shared a little bit about myself already. As I said, I am Lisa Robin Wood. I am a qualified professional coach working with middle managers. Specifically, I call myself the middle manager coach. And focusing around people management skills, well-being of managers, and really enabling managers to love what they do and not think that managing people is shit, because unfortunately that can often be the case, and I just don't think it should be. And I also co-host the podcast, The Coaching Cast, with Susie, who, as I said, sadly isn't here today. So Nathan, do you want to share a bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Before we get diving into the conversation today?
Absolutely. So my name's Nathan Whitbread. I'm also a qualified coach, and I think that's probably quite an important part of my story, because I've sort of developed what I'm doing as a sort of, I guess, an interested lay person, so to speak, and then recognised the value and importance of being qualified as a coach and having supervision specifically, which I'm sure Lisa would talk about a bit more. And the reason why that's important is because, especially when we're doing one-to-one work, there's only ever two people in the room by the nature of the work. So it's important we have oversight, and we know where to take things, and we know that there's people there who we can be accountable to, because we can do some fantastic work in the room. But if we don't have the correct accountability, we can also put lots of people at risk, and that's not okay. That's kind of back right there. But my real interest and passion, though, is this kind of idea of neurodiversity in the workplace, and specifically around making neuro-inclusive workplaces, which aren't buildings, believe it or not. They're bunches of people who work out how to do neurodiversity effectively, and actually take it from a hygiene factor, i.e. I've got to do the bare minimum so I don't get arrested, to a competitive advantage, i.e. how do I make the way our organisation works a competitive advantage that makes it stand out and helps us maybe win business or just wins hearts and minds. So people are climbing over themselves to come and work here because they recognize that this organization is deeply passionate about people.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nathan. And I know I felt extremely energized, like more passionate than I normally am, about people and inclusiveness and really helping all of us to thrive from having conversations with you, and I'm sure everyone else will after today. So let's dive into that chat then. As I said at the beginning to any of you who were here, Nathan and I are going to chat. There will be time at the end for questions if you have questions, and I will ensure that I'll keep to time to make sure you've got that. But if anything's coming to mind as we go through the conversation, please do put it in the chat, and I will try and grab those questions so we don't miss anything. But I think to start off with, Nathan, it probably makes sense to talk a bit about what neurodiversity actually is, and also the term neurodivergent.
Yeah, cool. So neurodiversity has its roots in autism. So there was a woman called Judy Singer who coined the phrase, and she's describing autistic traits and autistic presentation. Now that the term has now moved on in many circles, and I'd say it's certainly in the UK, but also more broadly now, to actually encompass all thinking styles, to say, well, actually, to neurodiversity is the fact we all think a bit differently. Now, that isn't true for the States, I would say, where lots of individuals would still use the idea of describing neurodiversity with the association with autism. So what's important here is that when people are using the term, that we're really clear about what they're actually talking about. So I would always argue it's worth having a conversation. When we start talking about neurodivergent, that's when we're talking about people that think a little bit more differently. And that can often be around some of the sort of diagnosed criteria, so things like ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and all those sorts of things that are lifelong. But you've also got within this umbrella of neurodivergent things like PTSD. I would also argue that there are stage-based things that happen to individuals that put you in this space, like menopause, because actually when it changes the way you think, that means that you potentially get neurodivergent things going on. And the reason why it's good to describe it in the same space is because although the causes are different, the presentation can be quite similar. So the sorts of things that can be useful can be quite similar. So it's much more useful to have a conversation about what's actually going on with the individual than trying to somehow stick a label on them.
And I think that word there that you use, label, is so important and something to be really mindful and quite wary of, because I think the labeling of individuals can be so damaging, especially when it's based on interpretation and assumption, which too often I think it is, and when actually that label isn't helpful, which they aren't always particularly. And that's not just true of this topic around neurodiversity. I think it's true of a much broader conversation around identity and health and well-being and mental health as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Lisa. And I think and I like to think about it is that diagnoses are useful if they give you access to resources, particularly money, to help support. Where they're unuseful is when you get into that kind of stereotype. Because just take one of the many conditions that fall on this umbrella. So you take autism. Autism is a spectrum condition, like all of these conditions, where you've got going from an individual that is unable to go to the lavatory or communicate by themselves to someone who can do all sorts of amazing things, but yet maybe has some differences in communication style. To describe yourself as autistic is not necessarily helpful, because it doesn't mean anything until you describe, well, what does that actually mean for me?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for me in this situation?
Yeah. Because
there's the whole piece about, are we disabled or are we disabled by our environments? And that's really important when we talk about the workplace. I mean, the image I like to think about is, it's like the parental carer is holding a baby. They're not disabled until they need to drive a car and there's no seat to put their baby in. Then you're disabled, because how do you drive a car and hold a baby? It's not possible. And this is the kind of thing that's going on. The processes, the way we run things can disable people.
Yeah.
But we'll only ever really discover that when we start to have conversations about what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that delving deeper, asking the questions, recognizing everyone is different. So in that example, which was a brilliant one around the spectrum of autism, everyone in that spectrum is different. So although even though they have that, as you pointed out, it could be unhelpful to label them as autistic for some that actually may be really identifying, because it actually helps them to communicate, but it won't be true of everybody. But it's then even differentiating within that to be really specific about what people need, which is not going to necessarily be the same thing. So you mentioned that, and it's really interesting because I hadn't really heard of it put that way before, about the fact that the environment is disabling, not that the individual is disabled, which is such an important distinction. And I have to admit, I'll hold my hands up, I hadn't really ever thought of it in that way before, being completely transparent. So I think that leads nicely into thinking about the challenges for those who are neurodiverse when it comes to the workplace and what they can be.
So the answer is lots.
Yeah.
And it's really, but that's not to say, but the thing, I think the most important thing to remember here is that all of this stuff has strengths and challenges. There are strengths that help individuals stand out and be brilliant. And I think our whole role as organizations and leaders and managers is to help individuals amplify their strengths and manage the things they find tricky, which is true for everyone, but I think it's even more important in this space. But the types of challenges you can have, it could be around executive function, which is quite common in terms of organization and how you deal with stuff. It could be around having different kind of abilities to process at different times. So some people describe that as brain fog. So this is particularly relevant to ADHD and sometimes dyslexia, where people will describe having brain fog and being unable to function at certain times of the month or certain times of the day differently. So being aware of that. It might be to do with process. So if you think about our organizational structures, how we run meetings, do we make it clear what people need to bring, what's expected of them? As speaking as someone who really enjoys working in the kind of free flow of ideas, I'm quite aware that other people, that's their worst nightmare, not knowing what's coming and what's expected of them and not being able to participate. I was just having a conversation earlier today with an organisation who were talking about actually how do they build an employee resource group around neurodiversity. And actually the very people that want to be in it are probably the people that may find it difficult to share their ideas in that space. So actually, how do we kind of do the pre-talk that allows them to articulate that idea, so then the person facilitating can say, actually, I spoke to you before, Lisa, and I know you talked about this. Could you just come and give us your 5 minutes on why you think this is useful to this conversation? Things like that. So thinking about that structural stuff, I think, is really, really important. But the main lesson I'd take away from all this is that we have to ask.
Yeah.
To ask in a way that's appropriate, i.e., it's not necessarily when there's a room of 150 people getting everyone to stand up and tell us what the problem is. Sometimes we need to do one-on-one. We need to get to know our people and ask appropriately and work with them and trust them as well in what's going on as we work it out together.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, I know we're talking about this in the context of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And actually, this is a practice that is beneficial to everybody, regardless of how they are grouped, categorize themselves, label themselves. There's me trying to be as PC as possible about that. So I hope that's all right for everyone in the room. But I suppose that in itself demonstrates the trip hazards in all of these types of conversations. And I personally find it's also what holds people back from having them, because it's that, how do I best approach this? What is the right way to do this? And I think often, especially from a manager and leader perspective, it's the confidence to have a conversation and broach this type of subject and having the language to use. Because I think actually one advantage of this topic having the prominence it has now is actually there's new language being created all the time around it to help people to have these conversations when there wasn't before. But it is that trying to support even from a leadership and a management perspective, individuals to have the appropriate approach to be curious. What's your experience, and even I suppose in some respects leading on to that, not just your experience, but like your tip in that realm when it comes to having that conversation?
I think it's the thing that strikes me most is it's very tempting to diagnose, because especially when you know a little bit of stuff, because we all know a little bit of stuff, so we think we can, because we're naturally kind of putting things together in our heads. So I would always try and steer clear of diagnosis, but that doesn't mean you can't be curious and ask.
Yeah.
But think about the way you ask.
Yeah.
I've noticed. I'm interested. Is this an issue? And also the language of partnership, I think, is really important, which is I know is a coaching thing, but I think it's really helpful in our workplaces. How can we solve that problem? What can we do to move us forwards on this? Because we don't always know the answers. And I think we have to trust that the people that are most impacted by stuff have probably got a good idea of what would be helpful, though they might not have the full solution. But we ask in a partnership focused way, I think you can really move things forwards, because I think the answers are often simpler than we think they are.
Yeah.
But if we don't ask, we won't find out. And with that, I think comes the caveat. There is a huge danger that if we don't ask, that we can overcomplicate the solution, and the solution can then become part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. How often we get in our own way when we get stuck in here in the head. And what about from the other perspective, bringing it back to neurodivergent individuals, I think there has been so much stigma around neurodiversity, and you mentioned stereotypes in, historically, and, the real challenges that these have presented for individuals when it comes to trying to be a part of and be included in quite structured, formulaic environments like school and education, like the workplace, where there is a expectation of how it should be, how we should behave, what is acceptable, and us all trying to be like fitting into some sort of box or mold. What really, in terms of like from your experience again, is the support, or the approach that you would recommend to anyone who feels very much like, I require more support, but I'm not sure how to get it or how to ask for it in a way that I feel comfortable with?
Yeah, so that is quite tricky, because sometimes individuals feel that they can't share, because there's a whole thing about disclosure here.
Yeah.
So depending on your organizational structure and what the culture is of the organization, actually, because I've certainly worked in places where it felt inappropriate / suicidal in terms of a career to talk about this stuff. I'll never forget one of my first jobs where someone literally took a piece of work I produced and put it on a PowerPoint sort of screen, and then went through it line by line, pointing out all the spelling mistakes and all the grammatical errors, and that happens. And I still think, and I know it doesn't happen so much now, but that sort of thing has gone on, and that can really jade people's approaches to things. Ideally, I think it's healthy to talk about what you need and why it's useful. I also think it's ideally helpful to have support as a negotiated outcome, because we have a perception of what, speaking as the individual, we have a perception of what we need. But I think in partnering with leaders and also with other people within the organization to work out what's available and what's possible, we might be surprised about what could be there to help us. So there's, so support from a hygiene, what is often useful is things like coaching is quite helpful. Assistive tech is quite helpful. Something called a workplace needs assessment is often quite useful, because it helps you sit down with an individual who can work through with you what your strengths are, what the things you find difficult, and put some suggestions together of things that might be useful and reasonable, especially if that can then incorporate the manager in that process so they can get on board with it. Because what you don't want is kind of a project to sort the individual out that then doesn't fit with the organization. And they go, well, that's great, you've got all this stuff, but that doesn't work with everything else. So hence the negotiated outcome, because we have to work together ultimately. And it's about making adjustments that allow the individual to perform at their most effective within that organizational context. And there is a danger, I think, that we can sometimes treat the individual like a project and not think about how they're going to integrate really well, because they don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. You just want to be great at your job.
Yeah.
So how do you facilitate that? That's the key bit.
Mm. And it's, that comment that you made there about the experience that you've had, where, and I would say that's I think that's the assumption I have in terms of people's fear, suicidal for my career, is that being vulnerable in quite an extreme way. Like, we talk a lot about vulnerability now, and how vulnerability is a strength, it's a superpower, especially in leadership, which I know doesn't always feel like that for every single one of us. We're all different, and we all have different varying comfort levels when it comes to being vulnerable. Some of us are good at it because we're used to doing it, but as I said, that's not true of everyone. And I don't think it is, especially in this topic, because of historically how it's been viewed. I think, if someone is really feeling that way, feeling fearful, what would your advice be to them for that situation? I know you mentioned culture, which is so important in an organization, and we're not all fortunate to be in a place we feel safe, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, you do ultimately have protection under the Equality Act. So there is protection under the Equality Act that says you cannot be treated less favourably because of your disability. And a disability is defined as something that impacts you for a period of 12 months or greater. So all of these conditions we're talking about here generally fall into that. So there is, of course, the kind of legal recourse, which is challenging, difficult, and pretty scary, especially if you want to stay in employment, because there is all those fearful messages about, well, if I raise a grievance, if I go down that route, how is that going to reflect on my future career? That can be really difficult. So I always suggest the first course of action is to try and work it out with the employer and with the line manager, and maybe even talking with someone outside. So if you've got like an employee support group or a HR function or some sort of employee assistance piece who can mediate and start to work it out, that can be really, really helpful, because this is all about conversations. And I would say, yes, there are some unkind people in this world, but I think, and maybe I'm glass half full on this, the majority of people want best intention of people to be effective at their job. They want them to do really well, and especially if you're a leader, because actually the better your people are, the better you look. And the whole purpose of being a leader is that you train your people up so they'll take your job off you, so you can go and do something else, is my view. But so actually, why would you not want to embrace that and work that out? Would be my encouragement. But that's not to say that there aren't certain situations where you need to go down the other route because you're being bullied or something like that. But that's slightly different to the not being able to work it out, I would say. Yeah,
absolutely. I think it is that, no matter, ultimately, if you don't ask for help and you don't advise people that you even need help in the first place, they won't always know. So even with best intentions, especially in workplaces with multiple people, with managers who are overseeing a lot in terms of the business expectations, many people at once, there will be times when things get missed, because we're all human beings and we're not all necessarily able to see everything and notice everything, no matter how hard we try. And I think if you're really unhappy but truly believe it can be resolved with support, then that, it's urging you to find the courage to ask for help, and recognize that asking for help is not weakness. It's actually the opposite. That's showing true courage and bravery. And I think that's definitely, what I would be encouraging of any one of us, to be quite honest. But I think especially now, with the conversation being so much more, much more prominent around these topics, because what do you think's driving that raise in awareness, and the fact that neurodiversity is now being spoken about so much more, like more than I've ever recalled in my experience?
I think it's the topic of interest. I describe it as the sexy topic, but it's kind of, it's the thing, isn't it? It's kind of, and there's going to be new faddy things, but I think part of it is the fact we are literally talking about 20% of the working population, have neurodivergent
Huge
traits,
number, yeah.
if not more, because obviously this is just based on a bell curve, and so it could be higher. So this is real, yeah. The other thing with this is that every time I talk about this, even if the individuals in the room are not directly personally impacted, they generally have family members that are, or friends who are, or daughters, or nieces, or fathers or mothers, and suddenly you realize how real this is. And it's something we can't be ignored. It's just part of who we are. And the other part to this is, who on earth decided what normal was? Because that's the other challenge here, isn't it? We're working from this idea of normal that I've never really met anyway, but I'm sure they exist somewhere. I mean, maybe it's you, Lisa, I don't know. But
I don't think I've ever met anyone that I'd classify as normal anyway. I'm the same with you. This comes back to that labelling piece. Even normal is a label.
Exactly.
And who's to judge what that is? I mean, who said this is normal? I mean, everyone is so different, and isn't that brilliant? I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
It's great, and I love that picture. And just to show that sort of image. So one of the ideas that I really find helpful is this idea of intersectionality, which I know is born out of it's about particularly women of colour and how they've been disadvantaged by the things that have made up their life. But I think that metaphor stretches to all of us to say, actually, we are all wound up of different pieces of wire that make up who we are. Some of that's about our socioeconomic background, our educational history, our colour, our privilege, whatever that might be. But also it's influenced by the last people we worked for. It's influenced by the boss. It's influenced by our colleagues. It's influenced by our relationships at home. That all makes up who we are. So that's why this is only ever part of the story, only ever a lens to look through, because you can't define a whole person by looking at one small piece of the jigsaw.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that comes back to that whole encouragement around have conversations, be curious, ask questions. And, that age-old phrase, don't read a book by its cover, because what you'll see is never the full story of whatever is going on for anybody or what makes somebody up. Sam just offered a comment in the box. Unconscious bias plays a big part of it, I think. I think that is very true as well. I think bias in general, I think, is something that's, I mean, it's a bloody complex topic, that one. I'm not going to suggest that we start delving into it. We haven't got time. And nor am I equipped, because I hold my hands up. I think bias is something I'm always acutely aware of in myself, being a privileged white woman. It's something I'm always very aware of. But I think it's such a good point, Sam, to raise about bias in the workplace, which again that's not necessarily restricted to just this topic of neurodiversity. It's so true, the bias that we apply to everybody. and I think
you need to open it up to include inclusion, really. Actually,
absolutely. Thank you, thanks for giving the language there. Absolutely. The inclusion and the diversity piece, for sure, because isn't and I suppose this leads me on to the next question I've got, which is what is the power of neurodiversity? Because we talk a lot about inclusion and diversity at the moment. Again, it's all, I think, part of that wider topic, and embracing difference and how it can really enrich our work environments, which I'm sure you'll agree with as well, Nathan, in terms of that's very true of all individuals. But what would you say that neurodivergent power is from your experience?
It's not one thing. There's lots of it, which I know is a complete cop-out. So
no, it's not a cop-out. It's a fair answer, probably, because it's probably a slightly different question in that respect. Like, name one thing that could be good.
No, I was going to say, but what I believe it boils down to, at an organisational level, I believe it's about competitive advantage. I believe it's about innovative advantage. And what does that look like when you start to go below the layers? I mean, McKinsey have done I think it's McKinsey, I forget who it is now, it's done the report looking at diversity wins. And actually, you look at diversity more broadly, organisations are more profitable, they achieve more. There's lots of evidence. If you just look at the gender equality piece, diverse boards that have females on them perform better in terms of the way they work, in terms of the way they interact, in terms of the way they deal when things go wrong. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But then you start to bring in your diversity as well, so different thinking styles. You're saying, well, actually, hold up a minute, we can look at problems in different ways. So if you've ever read oh gosh, what's it? The Matthew Syed book I'm thinking about. I've forgotten what it's called.
I know the one you mean now. This one, it gets embarrassing. You're like, yes, as coaches, we know all the books that have ever been written.
No, it's fine. It's fine. But basically, Rebel Ideas. That's it. Yeah. So he talks about different thinking styles and the power that brings to conversations. And you've also got books like The Medici Effect, which talk about actually the intersection of different paths in terms of making you the unique point of one because of what you bring together. This is what creates innovation. This is what creates forward thinking. And this is what ultimately will drive our economy, I believe, and drive our services and drive our voluntary services to be the very best they can be by having people that think about things differently. Not to say that they're always going to be right, but the fact the ideas are in the room means that we can evaluate them and work out what to do with them and how useful they're going to be.
Yeah.
So that's what, and there's lots of things that bring that about, but that's what I think the offer is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you point out, the more ideas are in the room, the more alternative solutions, ideas will ever come out, because you've got so much more to choose from, to select from, so many more different perspectives. I think as well, from the profitability piece of business, yes, clearly you have to decide who your audience is, but for some products that audience is so vast, and therefore surely the more you can cater for, the higher your profitability will be, because you're appealing to such more relevantly to such an actual audience, because we're not all the same, and there are so many people out there, and we are all different. And so I think you can be much more appealing in that respect as well. I know for a fact, organisations, I think, that have only ever thought one way, I think have historically been famous for failing quite quickly, because they don't adapt. I think that's the other thing with different thinking and thinking styles and perspectives, is that actually you're able to adapt because you're potentially seeing what's coming quicker, because you've got that foresight, you've got that ability to evaluate quicker as well, because you've got people evaluating slightly differently, and again seeing different and learning different things. So I think your ability to flex and adapt and move, yes, obviously there's a logistical piece practically, but I think that can give you the advantage for sure. So it can only be a good thing, therefore, that we all support each other. And I think that's what this comes down to, is actually how do we all get better at communicating, talking to one another, being curious about each other, about our differences, being curious, not afraid. And
so I was going to say, Lisa, I think that there's a thing about intentionality there, because there's one thing to do this in a kind of neuro wash kind of let's tick the boxes, make everyone feel good sort of way, and there's another thing where you go and actually just do the deep work. So that sometimes is involved things like reverse mentoring, where you get individuals who want to share time with senior leaders to actually help them understand what that looks like within the organization. Actually getting groups together in the organization to work collaboratively and work through how we kind of support people the most effectively, and actually do it in a deeper way that actually kind of really starts to address the issues and think about stuff. Because that will throw up the things that we never thought of or never assumed.
Yeah, absolutely. Going in at the deeper level, so trying to actually explore and understand what's going on, not fixing it from an outside perspective, looking in, thinking that you're fixing the problem, but actually getting to the crux of it and looking at, okay, so what actually would work based on what we're being fed by the people who actually are a part of all of this. Neuro washing, I think there's a bit of that going on, because you've got, I don't know, you've got the same is true for the wellness washing as well. Like, let's tackle well-being, everyone gets a fruit basket at the end of the desks, and we'll send everyone on a yoga course, and we'll tick that box, because we think we've addressed the problem, when actually we're not really talking about what the problem is. We're just trying to put a band-aid on it and tick a box. I think that's true of a few different things. So
absolutely go on.
I'm conscious of the time, so we've already use a lot of the session, which is great. So you and I, we can talk for a long time, I know that, but I was really keen to invite our guests who've joined us, and thank you again to everyone who's joined this conversation, to ask questions to Nathan and to myself, obviously, but Nathan is the expert here in neurodiversity, and that's why we're here. So if you do have a question, like, please put your hand up, and I'll try and come to you in sequence if anyone, or as I said, if you don't feel comfortable, please put your question in the chat box and I can always read them out. Right. Cool. So I think Nathan, I think your first question is going to be from Lawrence. So Lawrence, right. There we go. If you just unmute yourself. Oh, have you? I think
you're unmuted and me remuted.
Oh yeah, I think you're still. That might be my fault, to be fair. There you go.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, no.
Nathan, I'm sure you're not surprised I'm the first person with a question. Nathan and I are in a business network together, and I'm the gabbiest member. So Nathan, I have a question, and I also have a comment. The question is about, okay, so obviously you and I both believe that a company can make itself an incredibly attractive employer to prospects, to potential employees by making it known that they're very accustomed to and comfortable with neurodivergence of any kind and whatnot. But a lot of the time when I see companies talk about this on their careers page, it sounds like they're just empty virtue signaling. Mm-hmm. So what kind of phraseology would what words would make a person read that, the possibly more than 20% of the employee population, what would resonate? How do you phrase it? Because a lot of the time it just sounds like blah 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 when I'm reading their careers page.
I guess I think if it was for me, so speaking personally, yes, what please. I found useful is examples of people that work there communicating about their experience, especially if they're senior leaders, because that's useful, because it shows there is no glass ceiling. It's not just going to get hired and then you're going to stay at the bottom, which I think is really useful. I think also a phrase, and there's lots of different ways to say this, but this kind of idea that it's okay not to be okay, and you can ask for support and adjustments at any time during your career journey. Mm-hmm. I think that demonstration of support throughout the career journey is really useful. And I think that's helpful, because that's the difference between it just being a recruitment gimmick, so to speak, and actually a lifetime reality with that organization.
Yes. Because as you were talking, it occurred to me that that having that conversation about people's communication styles and their working styles is actually valuable for absolutely every member of a company, because all people are neurodiverse from each other. Okay, so for instance, I worked at a public relations firm where it was a huge bullpen. There were no dividers. There were no rooms. It was just one big room, and so perforce everybody had to be really quiet. Okay, and I work better collaboratively, and I actually requested, can we have a noisy room? A room where it's okay for people to turn to each other and go, I have this really good idea, but I'm not sure it's a good idea. Will you talk to me about it? That kind of thing. And even if I were writing, which, a PR person spends a lot of their life writing, I wouldn't have wanted to be in the noisy room for that activity. But when I'm working on ideas for a client, I would have wanted to be in the noisy room. So, in other words, it's good for everybody to talk about working styles and communication styles.
I think you're right. And there's another huge debate about the open plan office, whether that, I'm not saying there isn't a place for it, and I think it does work well for certain things, but whether that should be the default is another question. And yeah, I've got some good friends that I violently disagree with on this. I think they have a place, but I don't think they're for everyone all the time.
I think, the point there that you raised, Lawrence, is valid, which is actually understanding each other's working styles, communication styles is really important. I think, Nathan, you raised the point, it's always going to have to be in partnership, because not everything is practically possible. So we have to recognize that and know it's about a bit of a negotiation that we have to try and adapt to one another. But actually, let's just have the conversations to plant the idea, the seed, the need in the first place, and we'll go from there. I've just saw a new question. If you have staff on your team whom you suspect has individual neurodiverse needs, but they've never said that they have, despite repeated gentle. Is there a question in there, Nikki? Is it asking for
what
yeah,
to do?
I guess it's better ways to kind of get people to open up and speak about their needs, rather than no thanks, everything's fine. You know, when you're repeatedly asking a person, because you can see that there's something not quite, you know, that they need something, but you're not sure how to help them, but they won't let you help them by not telling you. It's just a difficult scenario.
And is that, Nikki, is that you as the manager talking
Correct.
to an individual in your team? Okay.
Yes,
So
it's a new member of the team.
That's fine. And that's something I've come across a few times. So one of the things we've noticed in some larger organizations, they've recognized this is quite a tricky phenomenon. And the reason for that is because as a manager and a leader, you have one hat on, ultimately, I think. And sometimes it's difficult to take that hat off, because there's some hats we can't take off. It's kind of like with me and my son. I could be a coach to him, but actually I can never take my dad hat off. So I'm never going to be a great coach to him. And I think sometimes in this area, you need someone different to start the conversation of what support might look like. So a program that I worked on for quite a while was called Neurodiversity Champions. It was just this idea, actually, you support an organization to have a number of individuals who aren't necessarily senior across the organization, who can then have a conversation about what's useful. Because once people have started the process of support, quite often they get to a point where they're happy to then talk about it. But if they're dealing with, especially if it's performance related, and they're aware they're not performing, but they're embarrassed about it, and they and for all the right reasons, their manager is saying to them, "We've noticed, you know, in all the gentle ways, how can we help? How can we support?" It's sometimes difficult to respond to that because of that power differential, even though that's not intended to be there. Whereas someone who comes alongside who has no power differential can sometimes have a much better conversation about what things can be useful, and potentially even direct them, if there's a HR process or some sort of support process internally, to it in confidence, because of that peer relationship. Does that help, Nikki? Sorry, I don't know if that's particularly relevant.
That's really helpful, actually. It's a valid point, isn't it, that you're absolutely right. He will only see me as a line manager, as a manager, and it's difficult, I guess, to open up. So I mean, something we have recently introduced that we signposted him to, and he's taken up the offer, which is great. He's like a buddying scheme where we've buddied him up with a senior member, well, not senior, I mean somebody that's been there a while, but he's on the same grade level. So hopefully that will help. So I'm trying different ways of doing it, but that's a really valid point, actually, that I hadn't considered. So thank you.
And I think,
the other thing.
Oh, sorry.
Go on. Oh, you go.
I was just going to say, Nikki, I think the fact that you're aware, you're asking questions, you're being there, showing support and encouraging a conversation is a great starting point. And it may just be about this individual needing time and a bit of space to work that through in terms of them realizing what they need, but at least they know that you're there and that you've set that up. Because I think, you know, from a complete foundation point of view, I think that's often, to be quite honest, what's missing for people in any of this sort of type of conversation, you know, whether it's about neurodiversity, but any conversation. Actually, the reason they don't ask for help is because they don't feel able to, because it's never been made aware to them the support that's available at all, even from their line manager, which is, you know, you would hope would always be the first point of call. So I think the fact that you're doing that is great, and I would encourage you to just continue to do it, and when they're ready, they know at least that you're there as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
I know Fiona sort of offered a comment. I wondered if that person may not know what will help, which I think is valid too. And I think, you know, sometimes we and ourselves may know that something's not right for us, but we're just not quite sure what or why. And that can take sometimes some space and time for us to work through. And yes, absolutely, having other people there sharing feedback and giving their perspective and maybe pointing things out to us that we're not aware of can be helpful. But I still think it's about us as individuals being ready to receive that and work it through. So that could be very true as well. Fiona. Does anyone else have any other questions for Nathan? As I said, put your hand up or put a comment in the chat. Oh, yes, Sophie.
Hi, Lisa and Nathan. Thanks so much. It's been really interesting and helpful. I just sounds like everything comes back to communication, psychological safety, flexibility as the foundation to everything, which is obviously easier said than done in lots of organisations. So are there any sort of resources or places that we can go to look for first principles, in the same way that we know if we're trying to support working parents, there are some easy things that we can do, like not have all of the social events in the evening. For example, that I personally find the move to everything being on Teams, and at the moment we've got Teams chats, WhatsApp chats, LinkedIn, Twitter and email. Like there are about 10 different ways that my colleagues who are across 3 different time zones can get me at all times of day, and I find it really distracting. And unless I turn off all notifications and have to have office hours in my calendar for deep thinking time, I just end up getting nothing done because I have ADHD and I find it very difficult without getting distracted. Are there sort of, 10 key things, or is there some resource like that, or is it just that different people work in different ways, so it just comes back to communication?
Well, I think just picking up the point, there are kind of some things you can do that are quite generic, Sophie, and particularly, ADHD is a really good example, in terms of energy management, for example. I don't know if that's something that's personal to you, but lots of people I've worked with ADHD, energy management's a huge thing, i.e. they maybe have really flat mornings and brilliant afternoons or whatever. What I'd say is there's something about contracting. And what I mean is the contract, and I think you've talked a little bit about it already in terms of how you block out time in your diary, the contract you have. Now, that may be something that's unique to you, but I also think there's an opportunity to do that more broadly and say, actually, this is how we're going to work as a team. This is how we're going to contract with the rest of the organisation. If you really want to get hold of me, you send me an email. I'll be on Teams in these hours and I'll be doing this in these hours, or whatever you choose. But thinking about that and giving that some structure can be really helpful. And particularly with managing things around overwhelm, which I don't know. Again, some people experience it, some people experience brain fog as well. You've got these kind of things going on. So being able to proactively manage that and work out what that looks like is really important. Are there any golden nuggets? Possibly, but I do think you have to make them unique to your organisation and your setting. I was just sort of writing that down as you're thinking about that, that sort of first principle. I'd say start with what you need. Work out what you need, and that energy idea I think is really key, knowing when you're going to be at your best and then thinking about what you want to do with that time. So for me, I know I can do deep work in the mornings and I can talk for England after lunch, which is great. But then, so if I've got deep work to do and I leave it to the afternoon, it's a complete waste of time for me. I'll be sitting around getting distracted, getting up, making a cup of tea. Hours can pass and it would just disappear. Whereas if I do it in the morning, I can be really productive for 30 minutes and get something really good done. In the same token, I know if I do my talky stuff in the morning, I'll be exhausted by the afternoon and won't be able to then operate properly. So knowing that, I think is really useful. So I'd say there's probably more of a set of guidelines to say, well, what's the scaffolding you need to be effective? And then have the conversation about, this really works for me. And especially working in a team setting, how does this sit with the rest of the team? Is it about covering, or is it about actually agreeing this is a way we want to work consistently? Is that useful? Sorry, Sophie.
Yeah, no, it's really useful. And just as you're talking about the energy levels, it just that's a key issue, because I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I was always one of those people that so I never had brain fog. Time management always already difficult, but I used to get into my zone at 4 p.m. and then work till 10 p.m. in a law firm and then still be in bed by midnight. But now just like as I get into my zone, the kids come home and then I don't have that flexibility to do that. So I have to find new ways of working that I've never had to do before, and then integrate that into working in different time zones. So it's helpful. A lot of it seems to come down to sort of knowing your own needs and being able to set boundaries in an effective way.
And what I'd encourage you to do, Sophie, as well is, and I love this idea of contract, but you almost got to do a contract with yourself to say, this is what I need. These are my non-negotiables. and then I can work around the fringes. Because if you do that, that will give you a really strong base to start from. And especially as you start, because I would describe this all as sort of your strategies for doing life. You know, you've got this core of strategy that you do life and you know that allows you to perform at your best. So if you know that, you work out which bit's non-negotiable, which bit's negotiable, and which tools might be helpful to support me on the way. And it will change, but if you've kind of got a note of it, and it might be a really short note, you know, I do my best work from 4 o'clock, and I know that, and that means that time between 4 and 6 in the evening is gold time, where nothing happens that isn't essential, because that's when I'm going to be at my absolute peak. Then that may help you shape your day in terms of when you do stuff. If that's it.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. That was great. And thank you, Sophie, for asking the question. Just noting a couple comments in the chat. Nikki, love this point about energy management and contracting. Really good idea. Yes, I do as well. And it is a great idea. And again, it's true of everybody. I think boundaries is such a hot topic all the time, I think, in the workplace for all of us. And actually, I would argue in our personal lives too, which is knowing what works for us, knowing our limits and knowing what's important, knowing when to say no, because I think for many of us we find saying no quite difficult, but I think it's because we haven't really thought about what's important for us first, so therefore it's too easy to say yes to everything.
Well, remember, Lisa, saying no is saying yes to yourself quite a lot of the time.
Oh yes, I love that. That's a good one. I do like that one. And then Sarah offered talking to fellow ADHDers has also been really useful for ideas, so I think that's something potentially to think about for you, Soph. Lovely. Did anyone else
treat it like a project? I was going to say, just treat it like a project.
Yeah. And
we are all wonderful projects. We're all work in progress. We can always do something different. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. We just move on and do the next thing. But just don't forget the things you've tried and work out and that's why I think writing it down can be really useful, because when it's all going wrong, you can go back to your plan and say, well, I know this works. So which bits do I need to kind of trim to get me back in a good space?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. That's great. And for any of you who you may have listened to the episode with Nathan of the coaching cast, that was in season 7, episode 6. I've put the links to that episode in the chat, actually, for any of you who want to copy and paste and take that away. Nathan did offer that as a great tip, actually, which is to really approach yourself like a project, and to really look at, like you've just said, Nathan, actually, as a recap, you know, what are the things I could try, what works, what doesn't work. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work, I tried it out, at least I know that now. What do I want to do next as part of my personal project to keep you moving forward, and just learning all the time about what really works for you, and just learning in general about yourself overall. Fab. Did anyone else have any other questions? I'm just looking around. I've got nothing more in the comment books. I know we had a question ourselves, actually, which is an additional question from Susie and I will admit, Nathan, that I wouldn't mind throwing out there, which is, when it comes to making changes to the workplace to really support people to thrive and be themselves, what comes to mind that you can offer that doesn't require a huge investment, either from, you know, when I talk about investment, I mean cost, not necessarily time or effort, both from an organisation's perspective and an individual's?
I think Brené Brown's got the best approach to this when she says to be clear is to be kind and to be unclear is to be unkind, because actually that is what this is all about, being clear about what you need from me as an individual and being clear about what the expectations are. Because if we do, and that goes across all sorts of stuff, obviously, you know, in terms of how we do meetings, how we do what we want from people in terms of work, the assumptions we make. And sometimes people who have neurodivergent traits have a slightly different view of the world. So actually being really clear about what's expected is essential, because otherwise we end up making wrong kind of judgment calls and maybe do far in excess of the amount of work that's needed or required, or the wrong sort of work, or all that sort of stuff. So just that clarity, and then from there working out how to move forwards. Yeah,
it's my favourite quote ever: be clear as being kind, being kind. I used it today, so I can really relate to that. And thank you so much for sharing it. So just to conclude today, then I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining Nathan and I today. As I said, sadly it would have been Nathan, myself and Susie Hunt as well, my podcast partner, who is so disappointed that she's sick and isn't able to be here. So I hope I've done her and the podcast justice by doing this myself. But I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for joining, and a huge thank you to Nathan as well for giving us his time and his expertise. As I mentioned, I have put into the comments links to both the Coaching Cast podcast and the specific episode that we recorded with Nathan. That was season 7, episode 6, so our most recent season. And I've shared the links there to Spotify, Apple, and also our YouTube channel, which is where the recording of this will be placed. You've also got the Coaching Cast website, which is where links to all of our episodes are from all 7 seasons. As I said, we've got a lot of them, covering a wide range of topics, and where you can learn a bit more about Nathan. And then I've also shared Nathan's both LinkedIn profile and Nathan's website, the Neurodivergent Coach. So should you want to learn more about Nathan's work as a neurodivergent coach, and have the ability to connect with him further outside of this conversation, then you're able to do that. But yeah, I just want to say, like I said, thank you so much again. And Nathan, I don't know whether you want to add anything before we finish.
Well, I just wanted to say, if this has promoted anything in you that you feel like you need another conversation, please get in contact. That's fine. And there's no stupid questions here. As I say, the only stupid questions I think are the ones we don't ask, actually. But they do need to be asked. And I just want to encourage this is we're all wonderful human beings. Neurodiversity is just part of the equation, and actually anything that, I know Lisa feels the same way, anything we can do to support individuals and leaders to be their very best and most efficient, we're really keen to get involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally concur with that. So thank you, Nathan, for adding it. And I just want to say thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And yeah, just get connected. That'd be great. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.